we're joined now by Matt Hladik from The Spun, covering college basketball. What's going on, Matt? How are you?
What's up, fellas? How you guys doing?
We are hanging in there. Just a couple of hosts arguing about conference strength and who's good and who isn't. And man, I know we say this every year, Matt, but it seems like the gray or the minutia, it seems to be a little greater this year, further out, right? The pool is bigger. Agree or disagree that it's a little more muddled in the middle, in the back end than normal?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few teams kind of standing out at the top. I would say that the two best teams right now, I think going into March are Auburn and Duke. But I don't necessarily think, I think they're clearly the two best right now. I don't necessarily think it's a situation where, either one of them looks like they can't be beaten in March, especially with, you see how deep the SEC is. There's some other contenders there. As good as Duke is, they haven't necessarily been challenged in the ACC. So you wonder what might happen if a team gets them in the tournament and it's a close game late. I think that beyond that, when you look around the country, there's so many good teams that it could make for a really interesting month of March, because there's a bunch of schools that I could see getting to the second weekend, maybe even making a run to the Elite Eight or getting knocked out early, depending on what their matchup looks like. So the bubble is really weird this year. It's a fight between, a lot of mediocrity. And I think that even in the middle, there's a lot of good teams, but there's not, a lot of separating factors between them.
Right. Let me give you the middle as kind of an example of what I was talking about. And I would probably, I don't know what you think about Florida, but I'll come back to them. I would put them towards the Duke, Auburn more than I would like the Houston
for sure
D group. But so like in the middle, there are these teams that I kind of I ask about all the time. I want to start with three in particular: St. John's, Missouri, and Maryland. Where when I look at some of these teams and kind of how they're built, and I get it, Maryland is kind of the outlier of the bunch, but they're in the Big Ten, and I think they're really good at times. I just want to know, what's the difference between if I give you two teams that have pretty good narratives, and in St. John and Missouri, and then I give you Maryland, who's it's seemingly still flying under the national radar.
Well, I think one of the things with Maryland is that there's people kind of wondering when are they going to take that next step. They only got to the second weekend once under Mark Turgeon. Cameron Willard has not gotten to the second weekend with Maryland or Seton Hall yet. So I think there's kind of that factor to go in. Also, I think a lot of people are starting to know about Derek Queen. They know what type of force he is and future NBA player, 5-star freshman. But I think that the guards at Maryland are kind of lurking a little bit under the radar, where people are not necessarily sure. They don't know yet how good they can be, with Gillespie, Rice, and Miguel. But I think that Maryland's a team that they have high-end talent, and they could be a factor in the tournament, depending on, matchups and how they play on a given day. When you look at the other two teams you mentioned, Missouri obviously coming out of a really strong SEC, picked up a great win a couple weekends ago against Alabama. They are a team that can get deep. Dennis Gates has done a great job of turning that program around from what it was with a disastrous 0-18 year in conference play.
And they're more of a sum of the parts, though, right? And I get Gil, but more of a sum of the parts team.
They are. Obviously they have Mark Mitchell, who's played well, transferred from Duke, and they have talent, but there's not an overwhelming star or stars that you have to be aware of where you're like, whoa, this is, a team that has, a future NBA stud or somebody that is a marked man, so to speak. But they are more of a sum of their parts. And again, they've been tested in the SEC and have shown up and put together some nice wins there. Lastly, St. John's out in, this neck of the woods in New York. It's kind of a vintage Rick Pitino team in terms of how they defend. They've really defended at a high level. It's not a vintage Rick Pitino team in terms of how they shoot the three. They don't shoot it very well. Now, if they shoot it the way they did against UConn yesterday, where they're 40-something%, they're tough to beat by anybody. But if they shoot typically, in the low 30s like they do, it's going to come down to who they play in the tournament, because I think there'll be a good matchup for, say, a Big Ten team or, an ACC team or certain Big 12 teams. But if they play an SEC team that can get up and down and score, it might be a little tougher for them to advance.
Matt, so I'm glad you brought up St. John's because, first of all, it's a team that I hate. But so I got to ask you, because the shooting is one concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you just look at it and you go, oh man, like that could be tough if they get into an unfamiliar environment in March and they just don't shoot the ball very well. But the other thing I wonder is, like, okay, let's say they get, I don't know, like a WCC crew or a Mountain West crew or something that's not used to how they play basketball. And St. John's is really dependent on the way they defend on a pretty loose whistle. Because if you have a crew in there that's like, hey, every time you're down the floor, you're fouling, because that's the case, right? Like, I don't know what that looks like in the first couple rounds of the NCAA tournament if they're not allowed to play the way the Big East allows them to play. Does that make sense?
Sure, and I think you've seen that in the past with certain teams from different conferences. Officiating comes into play when you're getting guys on the whistle that you don't normally see and don't know you and know your personnel from during the year. The Big East is a physical conference, always has been, it always will be. St. John's is a really physical defensive team. They remind me a little bit of the Houston teams that we've seen in terms of how they defend and how they play, and they're not overly great offensively. They also remind me a little bit, I'm a Rutgers alum, so they remind me a little bit of a step up from like the Rutgers teams that made the tournament a couple of years ago, where they were really based on defense, but they weren't great shooting the ball, but they were very physical. It will be interesting because St. John's, they have talent, but it's not a crazy deep team. And I think if they have some type of foul trouble, it could have impacted them, particularly down low if an Ejiofor gets in foul trouble against a quality opponent. So that is an interesting storyline that you may not think of, but could factor in come March.
So, my bad.
Go ahead.
So let me ask you something about, because you mentioned Houston, and Cryer is one of the better tough shot takers and makers in all of basketball. But what bugs me about them is exactly what I saw Saturday against Iowa State. Iowa State, top two scorers, arguably your third best player spends 3/4 of that game in foul trouble. And it was still a struggle to pull away. Teams that don't shoot it like that outside, well, they've got two, and I think can shoot better than 40%. So it's weird for me to say that don't shoot it as well, but that are limited offensively, that go through those offensive lows, that play at a slow pace. Do you look at Houston any differently, the way that Iowa State was able to somehow stay in that game being so punchless?
It's not necessarily I look at them differently just off that game, though the points you raise are definitely fair. I look at them a little differently just because of this is the way they've always been, and I look at their NCAA tournament resume. Now, they did get to the Final Four in 2021. They got to the Elite Eight the following year, lost to Nova. So it's not like they haven't had deep runs. Last year, if Shed doesn't get hurt, they might get beyond Duke in the Sweet 16, and they would have had a good chance to get to the Final Four playing NC State. But it's not like they're incapable of making deep runs, but it always trips them up. The lack of offense always trips them up at some point, because there's going to be a game in the NCAA tournament. If you want to win 6 games or win a title, you're going to have to outscore somebody. And it's not just going to be able to be won strictly on defense. The year that Virginia won it all, they outscored some people and they were able to win with their offense as the deeper they got into that tournament. And it's not like again, you said they have a couple of guys that can shoot the ball, Cryer and Sharp, a couple others. They're about 40% as a team from 3-point range. So it's not like they're, laying bricks, but that style they play, they have a tendency to play low scoring games, to get into some of those lulls, like you said. And I think that doesn't bode well for winning a national championship. I think your ceiling there is, 3 wins, maybe 4 Elite Eight, Final Four.
So, Matt, as we look at kind of the teams that we feel like can win a national championship, where's the line for you? Okay, so I'm going to read off a handful. You tell me when to stop, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Can Duke win a national championship?
Yes.
Auburn?
Yes.
Houston?
I say no.
Okay. Florida?
Yes.
Tennessee?
I think yes. I know there's always concern over how they play in the tournament. They've had some loss of years, but I think they have the talent to win one. Yes.
Alabama?
Yes.
Iowa State?
I'm going to say no.
Texas Tech?
No.
Michigan State?
No.
Okay, so we got to what, about 5 teams?
Yes, and I'm trying to think if there's any more that you could add in there. I don't know. And it's possible I'm selling a couple short, but I just look at the teams that are going to have to win, 6 games and get all the way through. And I think that those top teams from the SEC and Duke are probably your best options. And then Houston, listen, I know, like, for example, because we write about it all the time, the Spun, the BPI loves Houston. They had Houston as the favorite to win the national championship up until I think 2 days ago, and they still have them as either the second or third best odds. I think
They're third in Ken Palm right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, the predictive measures love Houston. I just have so many doubts about how they're going to play in the tournament and them winning, getting all the way through. So I admit I'm a little biased because I'm going off past results, but that's just kind of the way I look at it. And you mentioned Michigan State. I'm pretty familiar with them, watching a lot of Big Ten. This is probably Tom Izzo's best team in a few years, but I think they're a cut below national title good. I think they're second weekend, Final Four, maybe depending on matchups again, but they're not national championship good.
Who would be your bucket getter for them?
That's a tough, it kind of rotates to me. I mean, I obviously, the way that Jace Richardson.
I'll say, is it Jace now?
It might be.
That's funny how in love they were with Fears a month ago.
I think it probably, just because I do know the way Tom Izzo likes to trust those guards, I think it probably is still Fears. But Jace Richardson, I mean, is obviously looking like one of the better freshmen in the country that isn't, doesn't get the attention of a Cooper Flagg or, Dylan Harper. I think it's probably still, Fears or Akins, but it might be Jace Richardson, because if you look at their scorers, and I just pulled it up to be sure, I mean, they have, I think, 10 or 12 guys that are averaging, 10 guys, I think, averaging 5 or more, but nobody's above 13. So I think that is the concern. They have plenty of talent, plenty of options and depth, but if they need a bucket, which you're going to need buckets in the NCAA tournament, who do you go to?
So that's why I don't know what to do with Michigan State, right? Because Jace Richardson all of a sudden kind of changes, I think, the math on that team, because I do think he's more capable in a way that a lot of the other, because a lot of times a balanced offense is not always as good of a thing as we like to think it is.
Right.
Because we go, okay, yeah, you've got a lot of dudes that can do a little bit. You have one dude that can do a lot, right? And that's typically what we see win in the NCAA tournament. So I don't, full disclosure, like, Jace Richardson has really changed the math for me on Michigan State, and I don't totally know what to do with it yet.
Well, that and he can get to any spot on the floor.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, those are the guys that will win, that can carry you for 6 games in a tournament, and they were already pretty good, right? What I think is funny, right, about this year's team in particular, and it goes to DB's like middle class comment, right? So we got to call it 6 tops teams that can win the tournament. How big is the number that can make a Final Four? Because I think I could make an argument for about 40.
That's where it's really deep.
Talking about the middle.
Yeah.
Yes. That's where it's very deep, I think, because you look at there was a bunch of teams, like all those teams that you rattled off, the ones I said no to, they could make a Final Four. There's a lot more than just that group. I would say, off the top of my head, I'm just going around the leagues. In the ACC, obviously Duke can get to a Final Four. I'm not sure about Clemson or Louisville. In the Big East, I think St. John's can get to a Final Four depending on what type of matchups they get in the tournament. And Creighton could be dangerous for a long run depending on how that offense is, and they have a guy with a Kalkbrenner in the middle. In the Big Ten, I think, Michigan can get to a Final Four. I think Michigan State can get to a Final Four. There's a couple other teams right below that, I'm not sure
I
about.
hate to say it, but they're the Vanderbilt of the Big Ten because the way they play and they're a tough scout. I may have to give UCLA some run. I was down on, kind of how that situation was handled from a leadership standpoint. They're an interesting matchup because of the way that they play.
They definitely are, and we've seen them go through stretches where they look like they're going to miss the tournament, and we've seen them go through stretches where they look like they're going to be a second or third weekend team.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if they catch that second type of performance next month, they could be very dangerous because it's not like they don't have talent. It's not like they don't have the experience of playing in these big games. So I think when you're looking around the Big Ten, I think those teams are certainly capable of going deep. Purdue's a little bit down this year. I wouldn't necessarily totally discount them because of Matt Painter. But then you look, in the Big 12, I think there's a bunch of Big 12 teams that can get to a Final Four. I think, obviously Texas Tech, I think Houston. I wouldn't necessarily discount Arizona. Iowa State can get to a Final Four. Kansas is really, dumping. They're kind of really dropping right now.
Hey, stay right there. Let me ask, of these two teams with outstanding coaches, who are you more apt to give the benefit of the track record to, given the current state of their teams? UConn or Kansas?
It's a great question. It's a really good question. I think it's funny because I think the coaching, coming into the year, those might have been the top two coaches in the sport. I might give the coaching edge the benefit of the doubt to Danny Hurley because I think he's still the best in the business, but I think his team, the roster, it's not as good as it was the last 2 years. It's not, bereft of talent, but it doesn't have the horses that he had. I might give the higher ceiling in the tournament if they get things figured out and wake up to Kansas, because I think Kansas is a little bit more of a high-end talent on their roster, and they showed it earlier in the season. It's just kind of fallen apart here. So it wouldn't surprise me if both of those teams are out in the first weekend. I might slightly lean Kansas has the potential to go on a deeper run. That opinion could backfire on me, but that's where I'm at right now. And, a few days before March.
All right, let me give you three fringe, and we're panicking here in the Midwest over how Nebraska is going to finish. But let me give you a couple of teams in similar neighborhoods, and you can break the three down. I'll give you Xavier, Oklahoma, and Nebraska.
Oklahoma is an interesting case because where they are, they're 4-10 in the conference, which is I know that the conference record doesn't, we've seen teams that are, 8-12 or 9-11 get at large bids before, but 4-10, normally you see that and you're like, that is such a poor record that you're eliminated off the cuff, but they are playing in the best league and they do have some good resume wins. So you can't dismiss them, as getting into the tournament. Looking at Nebraska,
and still top 50 in KenPom.
I know.
It's weird.
It speaks to the depth of the ACC. I think that teams like Georgia and Oklahoma are being talked about as being, on the bubble still with such bad records in the league because of the wins they do have are good in the league. And in Oklahoma's case, they do have some excellent wins in the non-conference against projected teams getting in, Arizona and Louisville, among others. Nebraska is the Jekyll and Hyde team in the Big Ten for the most part. There's been instances where you see what the capabilities are of a Fred Hoiberg team from an offensive standpoint, where they look, really good. They look like they can beat anybody in the league. And then they've had some bad losses. They did just, split a tough road trip. They lost to a 500 Rutgers team at home earlier in the season. So it's been, up and down. I think if they get in, they can be dangerous because they have some guys that, obviously have experience playing at a high level, have played in the tournament. They have a coach that's has the experience being in the tournament in Hoiberg, and they can score. So they're a threat if they get in, but they have to still take a couple of steps to get there. And then Xavier, they avoided a bad loss to would have been a really bad loss to Seton Hall on Sunday if they had blown that game. And it's
That
interesting
was
because
21 at one point, right?
it was. I think it got to 3 or 2. So it got all the way down. They don't. The Big East is not, the Big East of old. The top 4 teams in the Big East, especially I think the top 3 of St. John's, Marquette, and Creighton, are really legit. And then UConn has struggled lately, but there's still that pedigree there, and there's still that danger factor. So we've seen the committee not be kind to the Big East in terms of at-large teams in recent years. Obviously, last year I think they only got 3. This year they're pretty much locked in for 4. But will they get a 5th? And I think that is what's the interesting thing, because the bubble is so every day it's changing. It's so chaotic. And, I'm just going to pull up real quick here. I want to look at Xavier's schedule so I don't get anything wrong here, because I know they have, I think, 3 games left. Winning at home against Creighton would obviously be a big boost. Then they go to Butler, and then they got Providence. So those are 3 games. I think if they win those games and they're 21-10, 13-7 in the Big East going into the Big East tournament, they'll be in a pretty good position to get an at-large.
So, Matt, okay, before we let you go here, I got to ask you about Gonzaga, because the metrics love them. But I'm looking at them and I go, okay, they haven't had a top 50 win since November, if I'm going by Ken Palm.
0-5 when trailing at the half.
Haven't had top 50 wins since November. Cannot, like, total front runners, as DB just mentioned. They've only got 2 top 100 wins since November, and yet they are a mortal lock. They're definitely not the best team in a mid to low major conference. Might be the 3rd best team in a mid to low major conference. But it's not just name recognition either, because the metrics for some reason love Gonzaga. Like, what is happening?
Another interesting stat that I saw this morning is that this is the first time that they've lost 4 conference games since 97-98, which coincidentally is the last time they missed the NCAA tournament. So they had a good record that year, but they lost 4 conference games. It's interesting because I feel like it was either last year or 2 years ago, we were in this almost same spot with Gonzaga talking about, excuse me, how they had relatively few big wins. The predictive metrics and the pedigree were there. They were going to get in, but people weren't sure how deserving or what they were going to do. And then they ended up in the Sweet 16. So they kind of had their typical kind of March showing. Again, you talk about a coach who's proven himself in Mark Few. I wouldn't put it past him to, assuming they do get in, to have them playing well in the tournament and, where they can win a game or 2. Obviously, it's not like they don't have talent, with Ike and Khalif Battle and Nemhard. Like, these are all guys with a lot of experience in college, some of it in the tournament. So, I don't, by the way, I think is it Graham Ike or Ike? I always forget. My apologies if I mispronounced his name. But anyway, Gonzaga is a really interesting team to me, because I think if they were anybody other than Gonzaga, they wouldn't really be in consideration for an at-large bid, or they would have work to do. But I do think that at least in the perception or the bracketologist looking at it, you give more weight to that name because of their past and because of what their program has done. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they close out. I'm assuming they're getting in, but how they're seeded, how they're treated by the committee will be also fascinating. And then ultimately, how do they perform?
Let me get you out of here on this. Just kind of quick. Vanderbilt, in or out?
I think when all is said and done, I think they're going to be in.
Carolina, new head coach or no?
I do.
Yeah, I as a diehard, it can't happen fast enough.
I know. Yeah, I say no, but I think the seat's going to be red hot for him going into next year. And I think you were going to say, like, it's crazy to think about in the last 3 years since that run to the title game, they might miss the tournament 2 times in 3 years. Once when they were preseason number 1, and then it's been really fits and starts for Hubert there. So I think he's just going to be under a really hot seat next year.
One last one, really. New coach in Austin.
I lean yes.
It's not good over the weekend for old Ted.
Yeah.
That's our guy, Matt Hladik from The Spun. Matt, we appreciate the time as always. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Matt.
Always my pleasure, fellas. Always.